32 years of homicide work teaches you that the most dangerous thing in any room is not the person who is upset. It is the person who should be upset and isn't. Remember that it becomes relevant. My name is William Stone. I am 60 years old, and I spent the better part of my adult life as a detective with the Charleston Police Department. 20 of those years in homicide. The last 12 as a senior investigator running cases that other detectives had given up on. I retired at 57, which is younger than most people expect. And the answer to why is simple. I had seen enough. 32 years is a long time to spend in the company of what human beings do to each other when they think nobody is watching. I retired with a full pension. A 3-bedroom craftsman on Rutland Avenue in the Cannonboro neighborhood of Charleston, and the firm intention of spending my remaining energy on things that were worth it. My wife Helen has been one of those things since 1990, 34 years of marriage. She was a high school English teacher for 30 years. She retired the same year I did, which was either excellent planning or the universe deciding we had both done enough. Helen is 58 years old, and she is the kind of woman who wins arguments by quoting novels at you and is somehow never wrong. She has strong opinions about grammar, weak opinions about sports, and the specific patience of a person who spent 3 decades managing classrooms full of teenagers without losing her fundamental warmth. I have seen a great deal of human suffering in my career. None of it prepared me for what I walked into on a Wednesday afternoon in August. I had been in Columbia, South Carolina's state capital, 2 hours up at 26 for expert witness testimony in a civil litigation case. I testify a few times a year now as part of my consulting work for law firms. It pays reasonably, and it keeps the mind sharp, which at 60 is not nothing. The case was expected to run 2 days. I left on Tuesday morning. August 6th. Helen waved from the porch. I told her I'd be back Thursday. On Wednesday morning, the plaintiff's attorneys and the defense reached a settlement before I'd finished my hotel coffee. Case over. I checked out, threw my bag in the truck, and got on I-26 heading southeast. I stopped at a roadside stand on Highway 17, about 20 minutes outside of Charleston, run by a man named Earl, who has been selling boiled peanuts from the same spot for approximately 30 years. Helen loves boiled peanuts the way some people love fine wine, with genuine expertise and strong preferences about salting. I bought a pound of Cajun spiced and put them in the passenger seat because I was going to walk in one day early and surprise my wife with her favorite thing, and that was a good plan. I still think it was a good plan. It is just not what happened next. I turned onto Rutland Avenue at 2:17 in the afternoon and noticed Brandon's truck in the driveway. Brandon is my son. He is 32 years old and works in residential construction in the Charleston area. He is married to Kelly. 29, 3 years into the marriage. The kind of woman who is always a few degrees warmer on the phone than she is in person. They have their own rental house in North Charleston. Brandon does not do unexpected visits. Brandon barely does scheduled ones without a reminder. So, I sat in the truck for a moment. Not long. 30 seconds. Maybe. Just long enough to register that something about this was off. I want to explain something about 32 years of homicide work. You develop a sensitivity to wrongness that operates below conscious thought. It is not paranoia. Paranoia is undifferentiated. This was the opposite. Extremely differentiated. Something specific was wrong. I didn't know what yet. I was about to find out. I left the boiled peanuts in the truck. Something told me they weren't going to be relevant right away. The front door was unlocked. I pushed it open and stepped into the living room. Brandon and Kelly were sitting on the couch. Here is the thing I need you to understand about what I saw, because this is the detail that cut through everything else. This is the detail I keep coming back to. They weren't watching television. They weren't on their phones. They were simply sitting side by side, hands in their laps in the particular stillness of two people who have already absorbed the worst of whatever news is coming and are now waiting for the next step. Brandon looked up. My son, who I raised in this house, who used to fall asleep on this couch watching football games, looked at his father walking through the front door a full day early without a single flicker of surprise. Not a flinch. Not a dad. What are you doing here? Not even a widening of the eyes. Just a slow, measuring look. I spent 20 years reading suspects in interview rooms. I know exactly what a controlled response looks like. I know the micro-expression that happens when a person sees something unexpected and suppresses the reaction in real time. I know the difference between composure and performed composure. Brandon Stone performed composure. Kelly smiled. It was the wrong smile for the room entirely. Small and careful. The kind that belongs at a networking event, not in the living room of a house where something has gone wrong. Dad, Brandon's voice was even. Hey, you're back early. Not. Dad, thank God you're here. Not something happened. Mom's in the hospital. Just you're back early. Where's your mother? My voice was even. 2. I had 32 years of practice at even. He cleared his throat. Mom had an episode this morning. She's at Roper Street Francis. They said she's stable. When did this happen? This morning, around 8. And you called me when? A pause. Not long. Half a second. We were about to. My wife had been in the ICU for 6 hours, and they were about to call. I put my bag down on the floor next to the door. I did not throw it. I did not raise my voice. I looked at my son for exactly 3 seconds. And whatever he saw in my face in those 3 seconds made him look at the floor. I'm going to the hospital, I said. Do not go anywhere. I was back in my truck in 45 seconds. On the way to Rower Street. Francis, I called Gary Cole. Gary is 62 years old and spent 28 years on the Charleston PD with me. A sergeant. A good one. The kind of cop that departments are built around and almost never recognized properly until they're gone. He retired 6 months before me and lives in Mount Pleasant across the Arthur Ravenel Jr. Bridge. He picked up on the second ring. Bill. I just got back from Colia and found Brandon and Kelly sitting in my living room like they'd been there all day. I paused. Gary. My son didn't react when I walked in. A silence on the other end that told me Gary had heard the same thing I heard. How long has she been there? 6 hours, apparently. They were going to call me. Another silence. Then, quietly. Bill, do you want me to come? I said. Not yet. Let me get to the hospital first. I'll call you. Roper St. Francis Healthcare sits on Bon Secours Way about 10 minutes from Rutland Avenue on a clear day. I made it in 7. I will not take questions about that. Dr. Patricia Owens met me at the nurses' station. She is 49 years old, a nephrologist, a kidney specialist, and she has the particular composure of a physician who delivers difficult information with precision and without apology. I recognize the quality because I've tried to practice it myself for most of my adult life. Mr. Stone, she extended her hand. I'm glad you're here. Your wife was brought in this morning by your son. She presented with severe disorientation, nausea, elevated metabolic markers, and early signs of renal stress. We've run a full blood panel. What did it show? She held my gaze. And elevated serum osmolol gap and urinary oxalate crystals on her panel. Mr. Stone, those findings are consistent with ethylene glycol exposure, that is the active compound in automotive antifreeze. The corridor was very quiet. How much? I asked. Because 32 years of homicide work means you ask the operational question first, and process the emotional weight of it after. The levels suggest repeated low-dose exposure over a period of weeks to months. This is not an accident. This is not a single incident. A pause. "We've contacted the police. Good," I said. "Tell them to ask for Detective Thomas Hill in the Financial and Domestic Crimes Unit. Tell them William Stone is on his way in, and that he worked homicide for 20 years. Thomas will know what that means." "Doctor." Owens looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone recalibrating their assessment of the conversation they were having. "Your wife is receiving Famizole." Dr. Owens held my gaze. "It's the antidote for ethylene glycol poisoning. We caught it. Mr. Stone, she is going to survive this." I stood at that nurse's station and took one long, measured breath. Flomazole 4-methylpyro is an alcohol dehydrogenase inhibitor. It works by blocking the enzyme that converts ethylene glycol into its toxic metabolites, glycolic acid and oxalic acid, if administered in time. It prevents the kidney damage that would otherwise follow. The earlier the treatment, the better the outcome. Helen had been in the hospital 6 hours. They had caught it. She was going to survive. I had 32 years of crime scenes in my memory. I had seen what ethylene glycol did to a body when it was not caught in time. I stood in that corridor, and I was grateful with the particular intensity of a man who knows exactly what the alternative looks like, that she was going to be all right. Then I walked to the window at the end of the corridor, pulled out my phone, and began doing what I spent 32 years learning how to do. I went back to my son's living room in my mind. The stillness, the controlled look, the wrong smile. 6 hours we were about to call. Here is what I knew about Brandon's finances and what I was beginning to understand about Kelly's calculation. Brandon had been gambling, not casually, the way men of a certain age bet on football games and call it a hobby. Seriously. Online sports betting, which became legal in South Carolina for mobile platforms in 2024, had done what legal gambling always does to people with poor impulse control. It had taken Brandon's rough patch and turned it into a hole. He had mentioned $67,000 in losses at a family dinner in January. In the vague, glancing way people mention numbers, they are hoping will be absorbed without follow-up questions. I had noted it. I had intended to have a real conversation about it. I had not yet. Kelly had been in the house in March. She and Helen had coffee at the kitchen table. Helen does not keep secrets, which is one of the things I love most about her, and one of the things that made her vulnerable here, at some point during that visit. The conversation turned to finances, the way conversations between a mother-in-law and daughter-in-law sometimes do. Helen mentioned the life insurance policy, $800,000. Beneficiary William. Standard coverage for a retired couple who had planned sensibly for 34 years. I had run enough homicide cases to reconstruct what happened next in Kelly's head. She heard the number, filed it, went home, and did the arithmetic. Helen dies. William collects $800,000. A grieving husband with a son in financial crisis. A son Kelly had been managing for 3 years. And how hard would it be to ask for help? How hard would it be to position a loan that never got repaid as the natural thing a father does for his child in the worst moment of his life? It was not a sophisticated plan. The most dangerous plans rarely are. They are just patient ones. Kelly had been patient from March to May, 2 full months of regular Tuesday visits, the garden project, the Tuesday morning coffee, the slow construction of routine and trust. Then she started adding ethylene glycol to Helen's morning orange juice, a small amount each time. Consistent, cumulative, untraceable, unless someone ordered the right panel and knew what they were looking at. Brandon knew. I did not yet know how much he knew or at what point the knowing had crossed from suspicion to silence to complicity. That was Thomas's job to establish. But I knew that Brandon knew, because when I walked through my front door on a Wednesday afternoon and my son looked up and did not react. A man with 32 years of reading. People knew immediately that the stillness in that room was not grief. It was a man who had already processed what was happening and made his peace with letting it continue. And that told me everything I needed. I walked back to the nurse's station and asked for a pen. Then I sat in a chair in that corridor and started building the list of everything I needed to do in the next 12 hours. First on the list, lock every account Brandon and Kelly had access to. They were named on a joint checking account, a family emergency fund Helen had insisted on 3 years ago when Brandon and Kelly got married. 2 clicks on my banking app. Done. Second, call Gary Cole and tell him to drive. Third, call Thomas Hill. Fourth, go see my wife. I didn't know yet how clean the evidence trail was going to be. I didn't know that Kelly had paid cash for the first 2 purchases and used a debit card for the third because she'd run out of cash and thought the stand on Dorchester Road in North Charleston didn't have cameras. It had cameras. But that comes later. Helen was in room 412 when I walked in. I have been to hospitals more times than I can count. As a detective, as a husband, as a son, sitting beside my father in his final year. I know hospital rooms the way you know any room you've spent enough time in. The particular light, the sounds the machines make, the smell of antiseptic underneath everything else. I was not prepared for my wife in a hospital bed. Helen Stone is 58 years old and has spent 30 years standing in front of rooms full of teenagers and making them care about things they were certain they didn't care about. She is the most alive person I know, not loudly. She doesn't fill rooms with noise. She fills them with attention. She notices things. She remembers things. She has an opinion about every novel written in the English language and is correct about most of them. She looked small. That is the word, in 34 years of marriage. I have never once thought of Helen as small. I sat in the chair beside her bed and took her hand. Her fingers were cool. The monitors beeped in their steady hospital rhythm. I watched her breathe for a while. Steady, real, present, and made her a promise inside my head that I did not say aloud, because Helen would have told me that internal monologues are a sign of poor editing. She was alive. They had caught it. She was going to be all right. Brandon was in my living room. I sat with Helen for 40 minutes. When I walked back out to the corridor, Gary Cole was coming through the main entrance. Gary is 62 years old and has the build of a man who played linebacker in college and never fully retired from it. He walked toward me with that straight-line efficiency I had watched for 28 years and gripped my shoulder when he reached me. How is she stable? Fazal is working. Dr. Owens thinks full recovery. I looked at him. Gary ethylene glycol, repeated loud dose exposure over weeks. Craig Gary did not say anything for a moment. In 28 years, I had watched Gary Cole process hard information and respond to it with a steadiness that I had always respected. He did the same thing now. Brandon, he said. Brandon was in my living room with his wife, both of them sitting like they'd been waiting for the second act. 6 hours after Helen was admitted. No phone call made. I paused. He didn't react when I walked in. Gary absorbed that. Thomas Hill already called. He'll be here in the morning. I need tonight to build the case file so when Thomas walks in, he has something to work with. Gary nodded once. That was sufficient. This is why I called Gary first. We went to the hospital cafeteria, found a table in the corner, and I spread out what I had started building in that corridor. A retired homicide detective building a case file against his own son in a hospital cafeteria in Charleston, South Carolina. If I had written that as a scenario in my first year on the force, nobody would have believed it. Here is what I knew and what I needed to verify. The ethylene glycol had been administered repeatedly, Dr. Owens estimated 3 to 4 months based on the accumulation markers, which meant someone had been in contact with Helen regularly enough to have consistent access to her food or drink. Helen's morning routine: coffee, orange juice, a piece of toast, every day without fail for 34 years. The orange juice was the obvious vector, colorless, slightly sweet. Ethylene glycol's faint sweetness would be masked completely. Who had regular access to the house Brandon and Kelly came for dinner approximately twice a month. More recently, I thought back more frequently. Kelly had started coming by on Tuesday mornings, ostensibly to help Helen with a garden project they'd started in the spring. Helen had mentioned it in passing. I had thought nothing of it. Tuesday mornings. When William Stone was out of the house at his weekly consulting call with a law firm in Columbia. Of course, I needed purchase records. Ethylene glycol is sold commercially at auto parts stores and hardware stores. It is the primary ingredient in automotive antifreeze, not a controlled substance. Available without ID, but purchasable with a paper trail if you're not careful, and a visual trail if you don't check for cameras. I called Thomas Hill at 7:45 that evening. Thomas is 44 years old and has been with Charleston PD's Financial and Domestic Crimes Unit for 6 years. I trained him briefly 15 years ago when he was a junior detective cutting his teeth in homicide. He is methodical, patient, and has the specific quality I always looked for in young detectives. He does not assume. He follows the evidence wherever it leads, including to places that are inconvenient. Bill Stone. His voice was careful. Art. Owens called us this afternoon. Ethylene glycol poisoning. Repeated low-dose administration. 3 to 4 months. My son and daughter-in-law were in my house when I returned. Neither of them called me during 6 hours of my wife's hospitalization. I paused. Thomas. The daughter-in-law has been coming by Tuesday mornings for the past several months. My wife drinks orange juice every morning. I need purchase records. Every auto parts and hardware store within 10 miles of their North Charleston address, going back to March. I'll have a warrant drafted tonight. There's one more thing. I told him about the joint checking account, the family emergency fund. I froze their access tonight. You should know that, because they know it. When those account notifications hit their phones, their behavior changed. I want that documented. What time did you freeze at 6:14 p.m.? And you observed a behavioral change. I was in the hospital. But I know my son. He would have called. I paused. He hasn't called. The silence on Thomas's end was the silence of a detective doing the same arithmetic I had already done. Get some sleep, Bill. A pause. Final. I'll be at Roper at 8 tomorrow. I went back to Helen's room and sat with her until 11 o'clock. She was in and out of a light sleep. The fomapizole treatment requires IV administration and monitoring, and the nurses checked in every 30 minutes with the efficient calm of people who know exactly what they are doing and have no interest in performing for observers. I appreciated that. Helen stirred once around 9 and opened her eyes long enough to find my face. William. Her voice was rough from the intubation they'd done on admission. You're supposed to be in Columbia. Case settled, I said. I came home early. She looked at me for a moment with those sharp English teacher eyes that have seen straight through me for 34 years. What happened? Someone made a mistake, I said. I'm working on it. She studied me a second longer. Then she closed her eyes and said, Your voice is doing that thing. What thing? The thing it does when you already know the answer and you're deciding how much to say. 34 years. She always knew. Get some sleep," I said. "I'll be here when you wake up." She was asleep in 4 minutes. I sat in the chair beside her and waited. Thursday morning, August 8th. Thomas Hill arrived at Roper Street. Francis at 5'8" with a legal pad, a recording device, and the expression of a man who had been thinking about this case since the previous evening. Gary and I met him in the family consultation room down the hall from Helen's room. A small, clean space with a table and 4 chairs, the kind of room where physicians deliver news and families absorb it. I laid out everything I had built the night before: the Tuesday morning visits, the orange juice, the timeline of access, the lack of a phone call over 6 hours, Brandon's non-reaction when I walked in the door. Thomas listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions when I finished. Did your son have a motive? Gambling debt. He mentioned financial trouble in January. Vague. Nothing direct. Helen has an $800,000 life insurance policy. I'm the beneficiary. Brandon knows the estate numbers. Helen and I. The attorney who drafted it, and whoever Helen may have mentioned it to. I looked at Thomas steadily. Kelly came by in March. She and Helen had coffee. Helen would have mentioned it. Helen doesn't have secrets. Thomas wrote something on his legal pad. Second question. Do you want to be present when we execute the purchase record warrant, or would you prefer to stay with your wife? I want to be present, I said as a consultant, not as anything else. You run the investigation. I'll stay out of the way. Thomas looked at me the way junior detectives look at senior ones when the senior one says something that requires a carefully polite response. Bill, this is your son. I know who it is, I said. That's why I want to be there, because if I'm not in that room, my imagination fills it in, and my imagination has 32 years of worst-case scenarios to draw on. Give me the facts. I can handle facts. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. The purchase records came back that afternoon. 3 purchases of ethylene glycol-based antifreeze concentrate. Dorchester Road Auto Parts in North Charleston. March 9th. May 3rd. July 22nd. The first 2 cash transactions. No camera footage recovered. The 3rd debit card transaction on a card issued to Kelly Stone. The Dorchester Road store's exterior security camera, a basic system installed 2 years prior, had footage from July 22nd showing a woman matching Kelly's description, driving a vehicle matching the registration of the car Kelly drove, purchasing antifreeze. Concentrate at 9:43 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 2 hours before her regular visit to Helen on Rutledge Avenue. Thomas laid the footage still on the consultation table and looked at me. I looked at the image for a long time at the woman my son had married 3 years ago, standing at a counter in an auto parts store in North Charleston, buying the thing she was going to put in my wife's orange juice. I have looked at crime scene photographs for 32 years. I have sat across interview tables from people whom had done things I could barely process. I had always believed on a professional level that I had seen enough to be largely unmoved by the specific mechanics of cruelty. I was wrong about that. Thomas, I said, my voice was even. I had 32 years of practice. File for the warrant. If you've been listening for a while and want stories like this to keep coming, it really helps if you hit that like button and subscribe. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps this whole thing running. So, thank you. The arrest warrant was filed with Charleston County on Sunday. August 11th. Brandon and Kelly were arrested at their North Charleston rental house on Monday morning. August 12th, at 7:45 a.m. by Thomas Hill and 2 uniformed officers. I was not there for the arrest. Thomas had suggested I stay at the hospital, and for once in my career, I took the advice that was clearly correct. I was in Helen's room, sitting in the chair beside her bed, when my phone buzzed with Thomas's text. Done. Both in custody. Call you this afternoon. I looked at the message for a long time. Then I put the phone in my pocket and looked at my wife, who was awake and considerably more present than she had been 2 days before. The FOMO treatment was working exactly as it should. The kidney markers were improving. And Dr. Owens had used the phrase remarkable recovery trajectory that morning in the way physicians use phrases when they actually mean them. William Helen's voice was stronger now, still rough at the edges, but present. You have the look. What look? The look you get when something has been resolved. You think you hide it. You don't. It's handled, I said. She studied me with those eyes. Bramden. She already knew. Helen Stone had spent 30 years teaching teenagers and 34 years married to a homicide detective. She was not naive about what quiet resolution looked like on my face. Yes, I said. She closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, they were wet, but only briefly. Helen does not cry in front of people, including me, for extended periods. She considers it poor form. Kelly, primarily Kelly. Brandon. I think Brandon knew more than he should have let himself know. The difference between the two matters legally. It will matter less personally. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then, when did you know? When I walked in the door and your son didn't react. You knew in the living room. I knew something was wrong in the living room. I said I knew everything else by the time I left the hospital parking lot. She was quiet for a while. Outside, the August afternoon moved past the window, the kind of late summer light that Charleston does particularly well. Warm and heavy and long. I want Thai food. She stopped. No, I want boiled peanuts. Did you stop at Earl's on the way home? There it is. They're in the truck, I said. Have been since Wednesday. William. They're fine. It's been 3 days. They're fine. She gave me the look that 34 years of marriage has made very familiar. Go get my boiled peanuts. I went and got the boiled peanuts. They were in fact fine. We sat together in room 412 of Roper Street Francis Healthcare on a Monday afternoon in August. My wife in a hospital bed, and me in the chair beside her. And we ate boiled peanuts from Earl's stand on Highway 17 and talked about everything except what we were going to have to talk about eventually. Sometimes the ordinary things are the most important things. Sometimes a bag of boiled peanuts in a hospital room is the whole story. The trial of Brandon Stone and Kelly Stone began in South Carolina Circuit Court, Charleston County, on October 14, 2024. I want to tell you about the trial. But first, I want to tell you something about the weeks between the arrest and the courtroom. Because those weeks matter, and they are not the kind of thing that gets described accurately in stories like this. There is a particular kind of grief that does not have a clean name. It is the grief of someone who is still alive, but has been transformed by what was done to them. Helen was home from the hospital by September 3rd, nearly 4 weeks after she was admitted, because ethylene glycol poisoning is not something the body resolves quickly, even with treatment. And Dr. Owens was not a physician who discharged patients before she was satisfied with the trajectory of their recovery. Helen came home thinner, slower on the stairs, and with a kidney function that would require monitoring for the rest of her life. She also came home with the particular sharp-eyed equanimity of a woman who has read enough literature to understand that what has happened to you is not who you are. She unpacked her bag from the hospital, put on a pot of coffee, and told me the kitchen needed new curtains. I said the kitchen curtains were fine. She said they were not. I did not argue, because I have been married for 34 years, and I know how to pick battles. We did not talk about Brandon often, when we did. It was with the careful honesty that 34 years of marriage makes possible. The kind where you say the thing you actually mean, rather than the thing that sounds better. He wasn't strong enough to stop it. Helen said one evening in late September. We were on the back porch, the September air finally releasing some of the August heat. Kelly found the policy. Kelly built the plan. Kelly administered it. Brandon knew. He knew, and he didn't stop it, and he didn't call you. That's accurate. I said that's worse than if he'd done it himself in some ways, because he made a choice over and over for 3 months. Every Tuesday morning, he made the choice not to call his father. She was right. I had spent 32 years in homicide, understanding the difference between the person who commits the act and the person who stands by while it happens. The law draws that distinction. The sentence reflects it. But Helen was right that in some of the ways that matter most, the distinction collapses. Brandon's attorney entered a guilty plea to conspiracy to commit murder and criminal domestic violence 3 weeks before the trial was scheduled. The plea reduced his exposure. He received 12 years under South Carolina Code, Section 16,329, which governs attempted murder with the possibility of parole after 8. His attorney argued with some acute inaccuracy that Brandon had been a secondary participant who had not directly administered the poison. The judge acknowledged that argument in the sentencing. Kelly went to trial. Kelly Stone's trial lasted 9 days. The prosecution presented the debit card transaction, the security footage from Dorchester Road Auto Parts, Dr. Owens' toxicology testimony, the timeline of Tuesday morning visits cross-referenced with Helen's symptom progression, and the records of Kelly's internet searches conducted on her personal phone for ethylene glycol dosage information and life insurance payout timelines. Those searches began in March 2024, 2 days after her coffee visit with Helen, during which Helen had mentioned the insurance policy. The jury deliberated for 6 hours, guilty attempted murder under South Carolina Code. Section 16329, Criminal Conspiracy. Kelly Stone was sentenced to 22 years. The upper range of the sentencing guidelines for premeditated attempted murder with financial motive. The judge cited the deliberate nature of the planning, the extended duration of the poisoning, and the particular cruelty of targeting a woman who had welcomed Kelly into her family with genuine warmth. I was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. Helen was beside me. She had insisted on being there, and I had not argued, because Helen Stone does not respond well to being protected from things she has decided she is entitled to witness. She sat straight in that courtroom, with her hands folded in her lap, and listened to the verdict with the composure of a woman who had made her peace with what this day needed to be. When it was over, she stood, smoothed her jacket, and said, "I'd like to go home now." We went home. Now, I want to talk to you about something that is not about my story. Specifically, because what happened to Helen happened to a woman who had the particular good fortune of being married to a retired homicide detective who came home one day early. Most people do not have that fortune. Most people do not recognize what they are seeing when someone they love begins to decline unexpectedly. I want to change that, at least for the people listening to this. Ethylene glycol poisoning is unfortunately not rare in domestic abuse cases. It is the active compound in automotive antifreeze, available at any auto parts store, colorless with a faint sweetness that is easily masked in beverages. When administered in small, repeated doses over time, it causes progressive kidney damage, metabolic acidosis, and neurological symptoms that are frequently misdiagnosed as other conditions: chronic fatigue, gastrointestinal illness, unexplained weight loss, the clinical markers that identify it, an elevated serum osmolar gap and urinary oxalate crystals in blood and urine panels are not part of a standard metabolic workup. They have to be ordered deliberately, which means a physician has to consider the possibility of poisoning before the test is run. If someone you love is experiencing unexplained decline, progressive nausea, disorientation, fatigue that doesn't respond to rest, kidney function changes, and the cause cannot be identified, you are entitled to ask their physician directly about toxic exposure. You are entitled to ask for a full metabolic panel that includes osmolol gap. You are entitled to ask whether poisoning has been considered and ruled out. These are not paranoid questions. They are reasonable medical questions. A good physician will not be offended by them. The second thing I want to say is about behavior. 32 years of homicide work taught me one consistent truth about people who have done something wrong and are waiting to be found out. They manage themselves. They do not react. They perform composure in a way that is subtly measurably different from actual composure, because actual composure comes from the absence of something to hide, and managed composure comes from the active suppression of something that wants to show. I saw it in suspects for 3 decades. I saw it in my living room on a Wednesday afternoon in August. If you walk into a room where something is wrong and the people who should be upset are not upset, if you feel that particular differentiated wrongness that is not anxiety but information, trust it. Do not explain it away. Do not tell yourself you are overreacting. Your nervous system is processing something real. Let it tell you what it is. The third thing, document everything. The moment I left that living room, I stopped trying to remember the details in my head and started preserving them somewhere they couldn't change. Memory is honest most of the time, but it isn't perfect. Stress has a way of rearranging events, softening conversations, or sharpening them beyond what actually happened. Paper doesn't do that. Neither do properly dated notes. So I began building a record. The exact time I arrived. The condition of the house. What I observed before anyone spoke. The specific words people used. Written down as closely as I could remember them while they were still fresh. The account freeze. Every phone call. Every email. Every text message. Every subsequent action with a timestamp. I wasn't trying to build a case. I was trying to preserve reality before emotion had a chance to rewrite it. Looking back, that decision changed everything. Months later, when investigators started asking questions, I wasn't relying on vague recollections or uncertain timelines. I opened a folder and walked them through events one page at a time. Dates, times, locations, conversations, receipts. Nothing dramatic, just facts arranged in the order they happened. Truth becomes much easier to recognize when it's organized. One of the prosecutors looked at me halfway through the interview and smiled. "You were a detective, weren't you?" I nodded. "Retired." He tapped the folder gently. I could tell. The documentation I'd put together eventually became part of the prosecution's evidence file. Not because it was sensational, but because it was reliable. Reliable evidence rarely makes headlines. It simply gives everyone else something solid to build on. That's what investigators value most, not excitement. Certainty. A retired detective develops that instinct almost without thinking. You learn very early that memories fade, stories change, and confidence is not the same thing as accuracy. But the habit itself isn't limited to detectives. Any ordinary person can learn it. You don't need a badge. You don't need specialized training. You only need the discipline to write things down while they're still fresh. A note in your phone with the date and time. A photograph saved before something changes. A receipt you almost threw away. An email you decided not to delete. Individually, those things seem insignificant. Together, they become a timeline that doesn't depend on anyone's opinion. People often ask me what the most important lesson from that entire experience was. They expect me to say courage, persistence, or justice. Those mattered. But if I had to choose one practical habit that made the greatest difference, it would be this document first. Interpret later. Facts deserve to exist before conclusions. Once you have the facts, the truth has a much easier time finding its way to the surface. Looking back now, I'm grateful I trusted that simple habit. It didn't just strengthen the case, it gave me peace of mind. I never had to wonder whether I was remembering correctly, because I wasn't relying on memory anymore. I was relying on a record created one careful note at a time. Notes in your phone with timestamps cost you nothing. 5 minutes spent writing down what happened today may save you months of uncertainty tomorrow. You hope you'll never need them. Most of the time, you won't. But if the day ever comes when someone asks, what actually happened, you'll be grateful you answered that question while the details were still fresh. Truth has always been strongest when it has somewhere permanent to live. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more family-centered accounts like this.